From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hello, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, where all the great sculptors are dead, and we don't feel so well ourselves, do we? I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher living and working in Florence, Italy, and today we're going to continue to discuss the life of Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux and take a look at his short but stellar professional career. If you listened to the last podcast, then you know that Carpeaux was in some sort of formal education for over 20 years, culminating in his 6-year stay in Rome at the French Academy, where he completes his masterpiece, Ugolino and His Sons. Carpeaux returned to Paris in 1862, where his professional career finally takes off, and Carpeaux remained in constant demand for public and private commissions until illness took him in 1875 at the age of 48. So his professional career only lasted 13 years. Who knows what he would have accomplished had he lived another 25 years into the turn of the 20th century and remained artistically active during the periods of the Realists, the Impressionists, and of Auguste Rodin. When talking about Carpeaux, and how original and vital his work was in the 1860s, we shouldn't presume that the work of Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, as great as it is, represents everything new and good that was happening in sculpture at the time. You see, in terms of art history, we're really turning a page in the 1860s. Looking at art history as a whole, we can imagine everything before the 1860s as a series of rolling tides, an ebb and flow between periods and styles and eras. We give these tides names like the High Renaissance, Mannerism, Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassicism, Romanticism. We know their characteristics, and we can recognize the hallmarks of each style. Each had an overriding dogma. Each had a period of time where each enjoyed official approval from national or international powers. And for the most part, these periods in art history followed in an orderly progression, each evolving from or born out of a reaction to the preceding period, right? Well, in the 1860s, we can just throw all of that right out the window. If you want an overriding dogma for late Romanticism and really for the rest of the 19th century, that dogma would be anything goes. And that's what we should expect, really. I mean, consider that one of the guiding principles of Romanticism is the ethos of personal vision, individual feeling, and individual expression. We can hardly expect a recognizably unified style to arise from that ideal. In its early years, Romantic sculpture was actually identifiable simply by the lack of references and themes from classic Greek and Roman sculpture, and that was revolutionary enough for a little while. But that first generation of Romantic sculptors like François Rude in Paris and Lorenzo Bartolini in Florence, these guys paved the way for the next generation, of which Carpeaux was one. The older generation of sculptors proclaimed their freedom from the tyranny of the Greek ideal, while Carpeaux's generation sought to figure out what that freedom looked like. Carpeaux and his generation enjoyed not only a relative artistic independence, but a political independence as well. They were the first to have been born after the Napoleonic age, and so were to some extent free from the political ties which bound competing styles of art to either the emperor or to the monarchy. Carpeaux was born during the reign of Louis Philippe, a citizen king, put in power as a compromise between emperor and monarch, and regulated by a constitution. While Carpeaux was in school, this quasi-monarchy would be overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, who crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. Now, this so-called Second Empire, lasting from around 1851 to 1870, was a pretty colorful time, where the motto "anything goes" could suit the political and social climate of the Second Empire, and all of Europe, really, as much as it suited the artistic climate. It was a progressive age when industry, commerce, and technology started to dominate the political landscape. International expositions and world fairs became popular as peaceful ways of demonstrating a nation's economic power and importance on the world stage. The era of the Second Empire was born in the year known as the Year of Revolutions, 1848, and from this period many modern nations arose, as did the ethos of nationalism. We see the unification of several kingdoms into a unified nation of Italy for the first time, the rise of power in the Kingdom of Prussia, which would eventually lead to the nation of Germany, and also the rise of the working classes as an economic and political power inspired by Marxism and communism. In addition, the secular political power of the papacy and the papal states were relegated to a political backwater, concluding the inexorable decline begun during the Protestant Reformation and hurried along by the Enlightenment. At the same time, amid all this turbulence and change, the Second Empire was nostalgic for the age of Napoleon, and the court and nobility seemed to bask in the past glories of that First Empire, even as other sectors of society were thrusting forward into modernity. The pretensions of the Second Empire can be compared to, say, the lesser sequel of a popular movie. So if Napoleon Bonaparte was Star Wars, Napoleon III was the Phantom Menace. The Second Empire was all about style as opposed to taste. It was about entertainment rather than idealism. Art served as a diversion, a decoration, or at most propaganda, and not as cultural edification, although, of course, in polite society it was pretended to be so. But at the very same time, Paris was becoming recognized as the center of the artistic world, Europe's cultural capital, the city of light. Paris was becoming successful at finally supplanting Italy, and specifically Rome, as the place to train to be an artist. But even so, the grip that the French Academy and the École des Beaux-Arts had on official taste, it started to slip in the face of the Romantic movement. The academic style, rooted as it is in neoclassicism, became more and more irrelevant, or relevant only as a nostalgic touch with which to decorate new official public monuments. All in all, the Second Empire was a time of contradictions, of competing ideologies, and a world full of new challenges and opportunities, and because of this, it was a world of uncharted waters to which there was no clear path forward. It was the perfect setting in which new movements in art might arise, and in which artists might experiment with new ways to represent and communicate, and the ideas that they represent and communicate might themselves also be new. Anything goes. Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, the talented, arrogant, independent, and ambitious young sculptor, could thrive in such a milieu. Taking his cues from the likes of Bernini and Canova, Carpeaux knew that the path to greatness in art required patronage from those at the very top. When Napoleon's nephew staged a coup in 1848 and crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III soon after, Carpeaux, though still a student at the École des Beaux-Arts, he lost no time in trying to gain the attention and the favor of the new emperor. In fact, Carpeaux started working on a relief celebrating the new emperor a week before that new empire actually was officially reestablished in late 1852. This relief that he made is called The Emperor Receiving Abd el-Kader at the Château de Saint-Cloud. This relief, it illustrates the occasion of the then President of the Republic, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, granting freedom to an imprisoned Algerian military leader who had surrendered to the recently overthrown Bourbon monarchy, the monarchy which Louis Napoleon's presidency replaced. Notice that the relief isn't called President Napoleon receiving Abd el-Kader, it's the Emperor receiving Abd el-Kader, a revisionist glorification of Carpeaux's own design. The relief itself is done in the best academic style, and it shows the Algerian leader on his knees kissing the hand of Louis Napoleon. Carpeaux's sole intention with this relief was to curry favor with the new regime and hopefully attract the attention of the emperor himself. Carpeaux successfully entered the work in the 1853 Salon, where it went largely unnoticed. But undeterred, Carpeaux later plans to present the relief in plaster to the emperor himself in Carpeaux's hometown of Valenciennes, where the emperor is supposed to soon visit on a tour of various parts of France with his new bride. Now, the meeting didn't come off in Valenciennes, and so Carpeaux, he takes his plaster relief and actually follows the emperor on his tour, finally getting an audience with the emperor in Amiens, where he is able to present his plaster relief and actually outright asks the emperor to be commissioned to carve it in marble. So let me reiterate what just happened here. So Carpeaux follows the emperor from town to town, and more than one historian has referred to Carpeaux as stalking the emperor, until he's finally able to force this plaster relief onto him, which is nothing more than a fawning piece of propaganda, and then he asks the emperor himself to pay for a marble version. All this while still a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. A pretty bold move, if you ask me, but fortune favors the bold, and Carpeaux is granted the commission. Now, after returning to Paris and seeing to the marble relief, Carpeaux decides he's going to try his luck again and sculpt a small statuette of the emperor's new wife, called the Empress Eugénie as Protectress of Orphans and of the Arts. Now, instead of again stalking the emperor in order to get him to pay for it, Carpeaux contracts with a bronze foundry in order to produce an edition of the work and offer them to the public for sale. But the bronze edition of the Empress sculpture is never realized. You see, between Carpeaux's return to his studies and the agreement with the foundry for the edition, Carpeaux competes for the 7th time for the Prix de Rome, but this time he wins. I mentioned in the last episode that Carpeaux delays his journey to Rome by about a year, and although we don't have many hard facts about what caused this delay, it does seem that Carpeaux was hoping to launch his career as the favored sculptor of the Second Empire, and was wasting no time in doing so. Carpeaux must have known that leaving France for Rome would delay any sort of entrance into the emperor's court by a matter of years, and so Carpeaux was striking while the iron was hot. Eventually, his push for recognition from the empire didn't amount to more than just that marble relief, which he had already finished, and Carpeaux couldn't manage to get the funding necessary to realize the bronze edition of the Empress, and so eventually, finally, off to Rome he went. Now, this perceived need to be present in Paris in case the emperor came calling might explain not only his delay in going to Rome, but his bad attitude towards everyone and everything once he got to Rome. All of this seems to paint a pretty vivid portrait of an arrogant young man obsessed with ambition. But Carpeaux was only getting started. Once the Ugolino astounds Paris in 1862, the art world is Carpeaux's oyster. And we'll hear how Carpeaux capitalizes on his first major success when the sculptor's funeral continues. Many sculptors and sculpture fans listening will be familiar with the works I'm discussing today, but many will not. If you are not, just go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and in the episode gallery of this podcast, you'll find many images that are relevant to today's discussion. While you're at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral for free, and you can leave a comment or ask a question. So even though Carpeaux never became the official court sculptor of Emperor Napoleon III, he did eventually win a measure of favor from the emperor and received several commissions for portrait sculptures of various members of the imperial family, the Princess Matilda, the Empress Eugénie, and a notable full-length portrait sculpture of the Prince Imperial with his dog, Nero, among many others. And I should point out how important these types of commissions were for Carpeaux, and of course would be for any sculptor. Not only could Carpeaux earn money from the commissions themselves, but the nobility and upper classes would now be open for Carpeaux, professionally and socially. The higher echelons of society would now seek him out to have their own portraits made by the man who sculpted the emperor. And others that may not have been able to afford their own portrait could buy a copy of a portrait of a member of the imperial family, which Carpeaux made in almost limitless editions and variations. In fact, special mention should be made about Carpeaux's commercial output, which started in earnest with reproductions of The Young Fisher Boy with the Seashell, his third-year envoy. His commercial enterprises were completely successful and actually far outlasted his own life. And his legacy was sort of managed by his wife, Amélie, after his death in 1875. And after that, by his children until 1914, when rights to reproduce his works were sold to a foundry. However, his works entered into the public domain in 1925, and so now it's actually quite easy to find an anonymously cast edition of a Carpeaux on the open market for not so much money. His production house was called the Atelier Carpeaux, but it wasn't an atelier in the academic sense at all. It was a small family business / sculpture factory that employed dozens of people for decades. Not only imperial portraits, but also decorative busts, Reductions and details taken from many of Carpeau's larger works and monuments were also reproduced and shipped all over France and sold in shops and placed in exhibitions. Henry James was in Paris, and he records in 1875, "The shop windows just now are full of reproductions of his figures and busts. They are the most modern things in all sculpture. That undressed lady and gentleman who, as distinguished from the unconsciously naked heroes and heroines of Greek art, are the subjects of modern sculpture, have reached in Carpeau's hands their most curious development. In this vicious winter weather of Paris, behind their clear glass plates, they make the passerby shiver. Their poor, lean, individualized bodies are pitifully real. And to make the matter worse, they are always smiling that fixed, painful smile of hilarious statues. The smile in marble was Carpeau's specialty." But beyond his business acumen, Carpeaux was probably the greatest portrait sculptor since Jean-Antoine Houdon, and for a lot of the same reasons. There's an extreme naturalism in much of Carpeau's portraiture. It's true that for official commissions he had to follow certain conventions which would provide clues to the subject's importance, but generally his portraits have an intimacy about them and a psychological penetration that goes even deeper than Houdon was capable of, as burdened as Houdon was with the tropes of the Rococo and the ideals of neoclassicism. Carpeau's brilliance with portraiture comes through most clearly when his work is either cast in plaster or just fired into terracotta, because both means sort of keep the fidelity of the master's touch, much more so than bronze or marble are capable of. It's no surprise that Carpeaux was in constant demand as a portraitist. But at the same time, it's not portraiture that Carpeaux is primarily remembered for. Carpeaux, after proving his mettle on a monumental scale with the Ugolino, was highly sought after by architects to decorate the many building programs instituted by the Second Empire. A lot of the Paris cityscape as we know it today came about during the Second Empire, directed by the imperial architect of Paris, Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann. Public spaces, gardens, fountains, the wide Parisian boulevards were all carved out of the older narrow streets of Paris around this time, and it seems there wasn't a project underway that didn't require sculpture. Those were the days. Carpeau's foray into architectural sculpture began with the commission to help decorate the facade of the Palace of the Louvre. This was a continuation of a project begun by Napoleon Bonaparte, and it required the involvement of many sculptors. A new wing was being added to the Louvre, called the Pavillon des Fleurs, and Carpeaux was assigned a pediment sculpture celebrating imperial France, along with a relief of Flora, the goddess of springtime. Now, like with his portrait commissions, Carpeaux knew when to stick to expected conventions for official work, and the pediment he made, entitled Imperial France, Bringing Light to the World and Protecting Science and Agriculture, is no exception to that rule. It's very well done, despite its very well-worn iconographic content. And it's interesting because Carpeaux extensively quotes Michelangelo's tomb allegories for his representation of science and agriculture. But all in all, it is a formal, imperial, academic rendering. But when Carpeaux is given free rein with what might have been regarded as a work of lesser importance, namely the relief of Flora, Carpeau's true nature and talents shine forth, for better and for worse. Carpeaux succeeded in creating a large amount of friction between himself and the architect by changing and rechanging his designs, altering the scale of the work whenever he saw fit, and committing that most grievous of sins when collaborating with an architect. Carpeaux could not keep to schedule. The ongoing delays were mitigated only by the personal intervention of the emperor, who was disposed to let Carpeaux do what he thought was best, even if it meant altering the schedule. One argument between artist and architect was concerning the amount of projection Carpeaux gave to his relief for the head of Flora. It was too much, according to the architect, and once again the emperor himself was appealed to for arbitration. It was left to the emperor to decide who would win this skirmish, and after reviewing the relief, the emperor is said to have declared, "It really is the triumph of Flora." And the triumph of Flora is the name by which the relief is known today. The Flora project was initiated in 1863 and was finished several years later. But also in 1863, Carpeaux was approached by another architect who was an old school friend during his teenage years, Charles Garnier. Garnier had been appointed the architect for the new Paris Opera House and gave Carpeaux the commission for one of 4 allegorical groups which would decorate the opera house's facade. These 4 allegorical groups would represent the allegories of lyric drama, instrumental music, harmony, and dance. Carpeaux's group was the allegory for dance. Now, Carpeaux and the other sculptors had very specific instructions in terms of the dimensions of the work and how the composition was going to be, and the architect even went so far as to make sketches for the sculptors to follow. Each composition was to have a central figure that would represent the genius of each motif, for instance, the genius of harmony or the genius of dance. And these geniuses would be supported by 2 figures who helped to illustrate that motif. Now, the 3 other sculptors of the allegories, all very respectable academic types, faithfully produced what was called for. François Jouffroy's group of harmony depicts a winged figure in a toga, standing rather stone-faced and sort of neutral between 2 other figures also in togas, and all 3 of them are making suitably vague gestures while holding very sort of classical contrapposto poses. Now, Carpeaux, for his part, he did it just a little bit differently. Instead of a figure in a toga standing in contrapposto, his genius is nude and caught leaping in midair, both arms thrown over his head and with a joyous laugh upon his face. The genius of dance's figure is in the center of a ring of a half-dozen nude bacchantes dancing in a circle around him, with the head of a satyr in the background sort of leering at them all, and a fat little baby rolling around at the feet of the genius of dance, which represents mad love. Now, it's hard to imagine 2 sculptors producing work as differently as did François Jouffroy and Carpeaux. And if you remember back to the episode about François Rude, we talked about François Rude's relief on the Arc de Triomphe, which stands in contrast to the other 3 neoclassical reliefs of which it is a part. Well, the contrast of Rude's work with the others is nothing compared to the contrast of Carpeaux's dance with the other 3 allegories on the opera facade. It is a composition, Carpeaux's dance, unprecedented in allegorical work. I mean, it followed absolutely no conventions for such a work that was to be mounted in a public place. I mean, it's got more to do with these little erotic statuettes that were made by the sculptor Clodion in the 18th century, sculpted for the private parlors of noble gentlemen. It has more to do with these erotic little statuettes than it does anything monumental. It was madness even to suggest such a work as Carpeaux's. One might as well suggest, representing the Prince Imperial as the fisher boy with the seashell, or the Emperor as Ugolino. It should go without saying that this idea of Carpeaux's dance would be rejected. But it wasn't. The architect, Charles Garnier, remember, an old friend of Carpeaux, he knew Carpeaux really well, and he had seen that every time Carpeaux got his way, Carpeaux made a masterpiece. Garnier was also aware that, as a young architect, he was staking his future on trusting Carpeaux's genius. But it was a risk he ultimately was willing to take. In Garnier's own words, "I do not know which of us has made the greatest sacrifice in giving in to the other. What I do know is that, for my part, if he didn't want to listen to me, I had resolved to let Carpeaux have his own way. I found his model superb. I was struck by the vivacity of the composition, the palpitating modeling of his clay figures, and, all in all, I told myself, well, if the monument suffers a bit from my sculptor's exuberance, that will only be a minor drawback. But it would be a major one if, by being stubborn in my ideas, I were to deprive France of a work that will surely be a masterpiece." Man, we need more architects like Charles Garnier. Anyway, it took Carpeaux 5 years to finish his full-scale model in clay, rendering his allegorical figures in a manner more naturalistic and faithful to living models than any other comparable public work. He used a muscly young carpenter for his figure of the genius of the dance, and his bacchantes were known Parisian dancers and actresses of the time. Carpeaux modeled from life, but also produced rapid sketches for his figures in motion in pen and ink, similar to his experiences as a student in Rome, where he often went out to sketch people in action right in the streets. The carving of the limestone group took about a year, and it was finally unveiled in the summer of 1869. And we'll hear what Paris thought of Carpeau's novel creation when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners, just a quick shout out for my new sponsor. In case you haven't heard the good news, The Sculptor's Funeral is now brought to you in part by Blick Art Supplies, the oldest and largest supplier of professional art supplies in America. Everything a sculptor needs, from your favorite clay modeling tools, modeling stands, armature supplies, clays, plasters, molding and casting supplies. They have it all, and the shipping in the U.S. is free on most items if the order is over $100. And best of all, ordering your supplies from Blick Art Supplies directly supports the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. Just go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, click on any of the Blick buttons you find on the homepage or on the episode pages, and shop away. A percentage of your purchase goes to support the show, and it's very much appreciated. So the next time you need art supplies, click on Blick. And thanks. When The Dance was unveiled in 1869, it caused a sensation perhaps like no other sculpture before or since. Opinions of the sculpture polarized Paris and was a constant source of amusement or outrage, depending on which side you were on. In the support of The Dance, one journalist wrote, "The poetry of M. Geoffroy, the music of M. Guillaume, and the drama of M. Perrault carry on the sober, gray, and inert tradition from which only Rude and David d'Angers in this century have had the courage to distance themselves, and to which all of our wielders of clay adhere, as devoid of daring as they are of power." These three compositions demonstrate unquestionably, alas, the mediocrity of the geniuses who swear by the école. Messieurs Perrault, Geoffroy, and Guillaume did not even manage to do bad. They were mediocre, which is worse. Thus their groups seem to have been put there only the better to highlight Monsieur Carpeau's dance and to serve as foils to it. Now, on the other hand, many found Carpeau's dance, with the sensual and realistic nude dancers, to be no less than the representation of an orgy in stone. One critic wrote, "Women, spurned on by the genius of the dance, conduct a frenzied round, and the artist chose the moment when, exhausted and intoxicated by their own fatigue, they feel their limbs give, and abandon themselves to the movement that drives them on, which they no longer have the strength to continue or to stop." That, in all its horror, is what makes for the obscenity of this group. Now, interestingly, each side of the debate about this sculpture seem to have had similar views on what the dance actually represents, an unfettered display of movement and sensuality. The difference lay in whether one saw that as a good thing or a bad thing. It was the prudes versus the hedonists, basically. In some more, shall we say, adventurous circles of Parisian society, the phrase groupe des Carpeaux became a euphemism for certain other group activities more generally known as a ménage à trois. Eventually, someone took their disgust for the statue just a little bit too far and threw a bottle of ink at the statue, where it smashed on the hip of one of the dancers and badly stained the work. The stain was removed a week later, but the episode resulted in a rally around Carpeaux in support of his work. Even so, an opinion on both sides of the argument was that the statue really did not match the others, and either the dance or the other three allegories had to go. Eventually, the emperor himself had to step in and decided that Carpeau's group be removed and replaced with another work. Naturally, Carpeaux was furious, and he published an open letter in the newspaper in protest of this, but the emperor was the last word on the matter. Another sculptor, Charles Alphonse Goumery, was chosen to create a new genius of the dance, and it was completed in a few years. But the new work was never mounted, and Carpeau's sculpture was not removed. Some events took place in the few years between the unveiling of the dance and the creation of the replacement, which would intervene in the plan to remove Carpeau's work. Just a matter of months after the decision was made to replace the statue, a series of political uprisings, known as the Siege of Paris, coincided with France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and this resulted in the Emperor Napoleon III being deposed and replaced by the Paris Commune. The entire incident about the sculpture was practically forgotten in the mayhem that was Paris from 1870 to 1872. And when Carpeaux himself died in 1875, the thought of harming his legacy in this way was ultimately rejected. By the time of his early death, Carpeaux had cemented his artistic standing in Paris and in Europe as the preeminent voice of modernity in sculpture. Now, Carpeaux's work is remembered today for its vivacity and its virtuosity, and rightly so. But it should also be remembered for being an early example of what figurative sculpture could be when sculptors look beyond the influence of classical Greek and Roman sculpture. Even Carpeaux's Ugolino can be compared to the antique sculpture of the Laocoon only in their shared sentiments of agony expressed through form, and not in terms of any explicit emulation of any classical ideal. I think many sculptors and painters and others mark World War I or the Armory Arts Show in 1914 as the tipping point in art, right? The border between the Western European tradition and modernism, where some sort of gulf separates what has come before with what we now have in regards to art. And that's not incorrect, and I believe it myself. But the change from figurative art to abstract and modernist art is only one way in which art changed its fundamental principles in the recent past. The movement in the middle of the 19th century away from the classical world was at least as big of a paradigm shift as the advent of modernism. Classical thought and style has either influenced or outright dominated the production of Western European sculpture since the 14th century. Only a few sculptors in history have risen to prominence without or in spite of this Greek dominance. Donatello comes to mind as one, of course, as do a few other Florentine sculptors before Michelangelo, but then almost no one until Francois Rude and his protege, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. And I think it's a valuable point to keep in mind as we, contemporary figurative sculptors, move forward and continue to nurture this resurgence of the figure in art. Whether or not we wish to emulate the classical world in our own work, we shouldn't be ignorant of it. Only when we are conscious of what classicism really is can we choose to utilize classical thought and technique or ignore it. Otherwise, our ignorance might lead to mistakes in our work. What sorts of mistakes, you might ask? Well, how about the extremely common practice of sculptors who will sculpt a pretty little nude female model, faithfully observed from life, and then give that resulting statue the title of Venus? Now, perhaps sculptors who do this tend to think the title will lend them some sort of credence or respectability to their work, or otherwise justify the figure's nudity. And fortunately, the public at large knows even less about the classical world than today's sculptors, and they don't see a problem with a statue of the girl next door having the name Venus. But it's when academics and historians, people who actually know what Venus signifies, when they see that kind of work, they will see that the sculptor doesn't fully understand their subject. And if you've ever wondered why contemporary academia is slow to take contemporary figurative art seriously, well, this might be part of that answer. I admit one of my pet peeves is when artists today, while having no interest in classical Greek or Roman work or classical style or philosophy, refer to themselves, nevertheless, as classical realists. Classical realism is an oxymoron. Classicism and realism are aesthetic concepts that are actually in opposition to one another. But today, many of us make the mistake of calling any and all figurative art classical, which only serves to illustrate to others how little we understand about the artistic heritage we are claiming to champion. I know the term classical is used very commonly in this way, but, as practitioners of figurative art, we are anything but common. We ought to know better. Okay, end of rant. I only wanted to point out what a true game changer Carpeaux's career was, right? Carpeaux's dance was the death knell of the reign of the classical world in Paris. And from our vantage point of 150 years in the future, we can see that this turn from the classical language of visual art is likely permanent, as dead as Latin, except to an educated few. The unified voice of the academic style splintered into a Tower of Babel during the Second Empire, giving rise to a golden age in sculpture of unprecedented originality and creativity, in which Carpeaux's voice was but one of many. So when we think of the trends of art over the last century, and how it's adhered to an anything goes, no rules paradigm, we need to see that this aspect of modernist work is an effect of that paradigm. It's not the cause. The individualist ideal has been around for far longer than modernist art has. At the end of the day, throwing off the academic style in the 1860s meant throwing off a system of objective values, standards, and goals in art that have never been replaced, for better and for worse. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening. And before you go, I have a little announcement to make. I'm going to be in England this summer during the months of August and September, and I'm going to be giving a few workshops in various parts of the country. I'll be teaching everything from figure modeling using the sight size technique, to doing anatomy and écorché workshops, to teaching marble carving using a macchinetta a punto. I'll have much more information in the coming weeks, as well as information on the website, sculptorsfuneral.com, but I thought I'd mention it to you now. Plans are still forming and won't be finalized for a few weeks, but thought I'd give you a heads up now. And by the way, if you happen to work with a studio or an atelier or any sort of organization which might be interested in having me give a lecture or a lecture series, a demonstration, or even a workshop, get in touch with me. I'm available. Anywhere in the British Isles from late July to the end of September. I am generally available, but my schedule is filling up. And anyone else around the world interested in hosting a workshop or a lecture series, you can contact me as well, because I am available at various times of the year and I like to travel. Well, thanks again for listening to The Sculptor's Funeral, everyone, and don't forget you can find the complete archives of the show at thesculptorsfuneral.com. You can subscribe to the show and receive automatic downloads weekly on iTunes or Stitcher mobile app. And you can join in the conversation with other sculptors and with myself at our Facebook group page. Have a great week.